And we're back. To those of you who asked us for more and asked when the next episode was coming, thank you. It did encourage us. This is a long and rambling conversation, but we've included most of it here. It goes into topics that you might not associate with the podcast, but hey, what is meditation but life? You know, a while ago I was thinking that we should probably, if we're not going to do anything with the podcast, we should at least like have a kind of wrap up, like coda to it. Do you know what I mean?
To end the series.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, that chat the other day was like, oh yeah, there's loads of interesting things we can do, and I feel more positive about it because we are coming out of this
lockdown.
This awful
space.
Dreadful. Terrible time. There's a great podcast, the Blind Boy podcast. Have you come across it?
No.
And he's this wonderful Irish guy who calls it the goblin of uncertain times. Was his way of he didn't want to mention the pandemic, but he just kept on going on about the goblin. Which is a nice way to put it, really. Well, it seems, you know, uncertain times have not ended, but at least we feel safe now, vaccinated and so forth, to actually hang out in person a bit, which is fantastic, because that was kind of the whole impetus for the podcast in the first place, as I recall.
I don't remember. Many of their podcasts were not in person.
Well, they were.
I think all of them were not in person.
But when we first met, and we were hanging out, and no, it was like on the tube train back from that Awaken No Relation event that it's spelled differently. Readers, we'll put a link in the show notes. We were chatting with Liam and we were having a good time just talking. We were like, oh well, let's just record a podcast. It was because we were enjoying those conversations in person as I remember it. And then we carried on because we still had that impetus. But for me, after about how long did we manage? Maybe 9 months of stuff. By that point, I was just burnt out, and I still kind of am on virtual things. Yeah,
I think with work particularly being intense for you at the moment, like has been in this new project, and now everything has switched to Zoom as well, I think that doesn't help.
Yeah, and work is still, like I spend half my week on video calls, and that's just the nature of my job. So, yeah.
Whereas I don't really mind hopping on if, like, you know, we have a guest who is somewhere else in the world. Yeah. It's not really a biggie for me.
No, I'm up for it more now, as we discussed, because the goblins receded somewhat, and
balance is restored a little too, maybe.
A little bit. I feel a bit more grounded in the real world because I no longer have to stay in my home all the time and live in fear of other people in quite the same way, or live in fear of, you know, me giving something. You know, I still feel it. I get on the bus here and I'm like, am I wearing a mask? Yeah, I guess I'm wearing a mask. There's old people on the bus. I put my mask on because, you know, it's for them. And then there's all that kind of the goblin's still there because you're looking around at the people who aren't wearing masks thinking, well,
why are they not wearing masks?
Yeah, you arseholes. And the goblin continues. So here we are. It's 2021. At least it's slightly better than it was.
I mean, much better than it was.
It's much better. I feel much more grounded in reality. I mean, it's still like ridiculous things happening in this country. For listeners elsewhere, you might have heard that our glorious leaders have impaled the UK on a mix of xenophobia, racism, and just pure hubris to the point where we've lost like half the value of our currency, and we can't get petrol anymore, and everything costs more.
Well, it's slowly happening. We'll see if things change or not.
Yes, we'll see. It's going to be an interesting few years, that's for sure. Nothing new in the big scheme of things in this place, but
And so what about your practice, Bill? What do you envision for yourself?
practice. What does it even mean these days? I mean, so listeners, we had a little catch up the other day, and I was very pleased to learn that Jasmine's been keeping stuff going. She's kept the light. She's kept the light for us.
The triple gem.
And I haven't in many ways. It's interesting, right? Because there's times in my life when I've managed quite a lot of meditation, but I've also not been very balanced in terms of my relationships and getting on with people on a basic level and stuff like that. So in one aspect, I'm like, well, actually, how much does it matter? Maybe it matters more to have decent relationships. And I haven't managed that either, but that's one side to it. Another side of it is informal practice.
Yes.
Which is
very important.
It feels like a kind of crappy excuse in some ways, but in some ways I do see that as more important than, or equally important as formal, because I know I get a lot out of actually sitting down and saying, right, I'm going to meditate 30 minutes. It's just amazing. And every time I do it, I'm like, wow, that's so good. Right, I'm going to do, and then something sideswipes me and I never do it again. But just taking 10 minutes in a hot bath to not do anything and just have that experience. And these just little things. I'm out walking the dog, and sometimes I will just, count my breath as I walk across a field. And little things like that remind me of, I guess, some of the more monastic practices that I've benefited from, where people do that every day, and they're going to go and fetch wood and carry water and all that, and they just do that thing. And there's a real power in that.
Present living.
Yeah, beyond the intellect, just actually experiencing life and not just living in a daydream of your thoughts.
I mean, because that's what dedicated practice is really for, though, to get yourself up to a level where you can be more present in those everyday things.
Yeah.
And then it, increases the quality of that presence in those things as well. And then our ability to come back to those. So maybe if having informal practice, we are, say, present 10% of the time with, let's say, informal practices throughout the day. But then maybe with dedicated practice, it might increase to 30% to 40% because of how much more present our baseline level is. And then we remember more often, checked out less. That kind of thing. It's like a turbo booster. Totally. And I need to figure out how to weave some in.
How to get back there. What I managed today actually was 20 minutes of journaling.
Great.
Which I find such a powerful practice. It's not a substitute for meditation, but it's a parallel thing that some of the times when I felt most grounded in life and most kind of steady, on a, finding a direction to go, or when I was managing that daily, and just really able to make that space and plan and understand, self-reflect a bit.
Yeah. I from the artist's way, I had been doing the 6 pages a day for a while, and within a month I'd finished an entire book. So one of these books. And
when did you get into the artist's way?
A couple of months ago. Well, at least by April.
Oh, okay.
And I think I might have said, so this one has been since the mid-July, and I've just finished it. Where has it been? Mid-July. So if I'm doing it properly, I'll finish one of these books in a month.
Yeah.
if I don't, which I haven't been for this one, it is... I haven't even been writing the dates.
Doesn't matter.
That's when you know that the practice ends up... as in, when I'm not practicing daily, I don't write the dates properly.
Right.
That's how I know.
Right, yeah.
I just write the time of the day, 7 a.m.
As long as you've got the year on the cover of the journal, that's most of it for me.
Most important. Yeah, there's no more dates after this. But I would say roughly maybe August, so July, August. So maybe a month and a half rather than a month. Oh. Yeah, so still okay.
It's a great book, that. It was one of the reasons I got into journaling in the first place. And then it was about 5 years ago I read a great article on sort of why... Nice. Jasmine's recording the pouring of the tea. Wonderful. I got into another article on, why journaling can change your life. And that one suggested a kind of structure to it, a format of like, okay, I'm going to write down things I'm thankful for, things, kind of self-assess on where I'm at in my life and plan what I want to do to get to where I want to be and that kind of stuff. And I followed that for a good couple of years. And that was really useful as well.
So do you like those types of journaling books where they have, 3 things I'm grateful for, or what I learned, and then what I learned in the day, and then my most important priorities are, and then they have maybe one other thing like a quote, and then they'll do that daily. Do you like those?
I wouldn't buy one of those just because I'd find it annoying. But I did follow a template roughly along those lines for a while. Because I did find it, it's one of those scientifically proven things, right? That if you do reflect on things you're happy about in your life, you get happier. Yeah. And so I found that useful. And
why don't you like those books?
It just sets too rigid a format for it. There's a set length to each section. And sometimes I didn't find it useful to dwell in a particular bit too long. So I just I'd either have like... in the back of the book, I would keep a list of the things I want to get into each journal, and then I would just refer to that if I'd forgotten. Or I would, for a while, I was doing it on a computer or an iPad, and I would keep a template and just reuse that every time.
Do you think that the lengths that you would write would be varying, and you prefer?
Yeah, it varies a lot. And some days it would be like a load of stuff about now, and sometimes it'd be a lot of planning, and, that kind of thing. Yeah, I wonder how you found it in your 6-page thing. Like what sort of content's coming out?
I like to, I think, start with any pressing thoughts that are just there. Like, that's always how I begin. More recently, I've been starting with where I am in the space of the world, because I don't think I recall very well my days or where place and situation. But sometimes it's quite nice as a diary and would help for placing memories. And so I've been doing that. And then I sometimes do a little drawing. I think my most recent drawing was of 2 croissants. Yeah. Just to say what I'd ate that day for fun. And then I do lots of creative ideating. Yeah. And then answering questions of like, what's really important to me? Yeah. Or right now I'm trying to find out what projects I want to undertake. Yeah. And so I do a lot of idea progressions of what that might be. So I do loads of those, even if they go to waste and it's not a full thing. Yeah. It's just nice to explore. And then other things like, so one topic that's really been at the top of my mind is safety for women. And kind of going into what are the real sources behind these issues, and how is it possible to help solve such a huge problem, like worldwide. So these are like, I guess, going into big questions like, you know, how do we solve racism? How do, you know, all of these like types of huge topics that we as one person might not be able to fix. But I guess I'm trying to consider what would be the most effective course of action if I was to do an intervention, and what would be most needed. But this one specifically at the moment is for female safety, and then education for maybe children, male and female, on how to kind of stop this as a root problem. Yeah,
it's such a big one. I mean, there's been so many stories recently in the press of how policemen have been the murderers and rapists, and man, it's a big one.
Yeah.
It reminds me of another conversation I listened to recently on the Conspirituality podcast. Shout out to the authors of that. What do you call podcast creators? Which is brilliant.
Yeah.
And they had an episode where they interviewed this young guy whose name I forget, I'll look it up, he's in his 20s, and he's written a very poetic book about how he deals with the climate crisis. And in his life, and trying to figure out his future and what he can do and all the rest. And for him, it's the things that an individual can do are inconsequential in the face of the changes that we're already starting to experience. And for him, it's about policy and government.
Well,
and how, so that's what it makes me think of in that context. Like the institutions that can make the biggest difference there are those. I mean, the
companies as well.
The NGOs can do something, but they spend most of their time and money fundraising and paying the salaries of all the people who do the fundraising and all the rest. I just don't see them as very efficient. But you know, I'm probably wrong, but that's certainly how he sees it on the climate stuff, because it's the only way you can actually control the corporations who are causing the trouble.
Yeah, I mean, NGOs they might be putting some interventions across, but you know, there might still be the polluters who are still doing that, and they're only trying to then fix the issue that's arising.
Yeah.
Like cleaning the seas, you know, like charities might do that, or they might be trying to, well, I think the more effective charities would be trying to work with government in order to help them shape policies and stuff. And we have one, for example, Animal Equality, who is a great charity, Animal Equality UK. They have been working with the government. Well, what they do is they get investigative footage of farms, and then they help show that people are not even keeping to the regulations. And then the governments can be like, this isn't right, and then they bring them to court. So I think they are the second most effective animal charity in the world.
I love that, and I'd love to. Is there a ranking system for how effective charities are in general? Like,
I don't know if it. Well, I think
that would be interesting.
They are definitely based on, you know, where the money does go to, but how we can compare someone getting water to someone getting an operation.
Exactly,
Maybe not, but I think that they just base it on who actually gets the money and if it's going to the place they said. And maybe some might be impact with lives saved. So like malaria charities are notoriously very effective because they save lives directly from just nets for very cheap. So lives saved, but I think we can go into other qualities of, you know, how you can't really measure education necessarily, or the impact of emotional security or
yeah. And there's that fact that we were chatting about the other day that for every dollar in aid that goes to the developing world, we take back like $10 in debt payments.
Yeah, and what was the book that you had mentioned?
Jason Hickel, The Divide. Listeners, read it at your peril. It's brilliant, but kind of terrifying. It's an amazing book because I've known that there's this post-colonial state we live in is we have this kind of illusion of us being the charities helping out the developing world, but he outlines basically how a bit like Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs and Steel, which is also excellent, how the powerful rich countries are rich and powerful because they have stolen from the poorer countries, basically. And there's so many stories you could tell about that, like how, India, I think when it first encountered Britain, it had like a third of the world economy, something like that. And within a few hundred years, it was down to like 5% or something, and Britain had like got half of it or something. It was really crazy stuff like that happened in the last few hundred years. And also it's ongoing. It's never stopped, that story. And the way that we predate basically on poorer countries. It's pretty remarkable, and it changed my perspective on the stories of aid and charity and so forth that we have in the West, in the rich countries.
I guess a greater discernment then between, what is actually helping, or things where if they already have organizations there, or how is it that we can better help with structures that do actually help.
Yeah.
So it's even more effective charity. What does that even mean?
Yeah. And
because
again, it's sort of back to government policy and all the rest,
Because I definitely probably think that some charities will be doing good work and not taking anything back necessarily,
I mean, so...
Do you have pointers on where to, find that, or what types of charities should maybe be researched into?
I think there's stuff in Hickel's book.
Hickel's book, okay.
Yeah. He has a sort of chapter, the last chapter, on things you can do, things that help. But I didn't finish the book because I was found so horrifying. I got through a few chapters and I was just brutalised and I gave up. It's still on my shelf. But thank you, Jason. You opened my eyes to that. It's a tough one. It's yeah. Oh dear.
And I think, when we even think about let's say, the heart of the Bodhisattva and what it means to even have everyone awakened or to be of help or service, what does that even look like as things become more complex? In that same way, giving charity or giving aid or helping someone else, there's so many more barriers to what that even looks like now. It's not even necessarily a simple means, because one would think, giving charity, many people don't even donate to charities, but say for those who do, they would otherwise be thinking that they're doing something good. So there's always these, and it reminds me of, if anyone has watched The Good Place,
which I haven't yet.
It's very good.
Yes,
it's a show on Netflix, but they have this billboard of just buying a tomato. And you think that maybe buying a tomato from a local farmer's market would be good for you. But actually, that tomato was grown by this person, but that person, in order to have grown it, stole from this guy who then and it goes all the way back to a chain. So it's actually a negative effect.
Right.
And that's the kind of comical irony that one action, we can't see what the original action
so many
might be.
things like that. I mean, paper bags in shops. And it was like, oh, great, paper bags, they're biodegradable. But then the paper bags take 10 times as much water to make. And if we all switched
What,
to
than
paper,
plastic?
yeah.
Really?
If we all switched to paper bags, we'd have no bloody trees left. And I remember reading an article on that. It's like
Really?
how there's many examples of stuff like that where it's like, on the face of it, it's a good thing. Maybe it's something better. Maybe we could be making bioplastic bags that degrade. I don't know. But in that particular story, the paper bag thing, which you'll find in any posh shop now.
Yeah. I thought paper bags were good.
Me too, until I read that. And maybe it's wrong, but it's hard to figure these things out, right?
I feel like there's not one source of information where everything is current. Like, it's very difficult to know. It's the same with even just the vaccines. You know, there's loads of misinformation around, but we have the government website, and even the government website doesn't show all the studies that are up to date where we can look in a really nice format or that seems to be accessible.
No, it's a really tough one, that.
And then people can't make decisions because they don't have the information. But then, you know, we'll read on Guardian this like study, and then that will change our minds. But then someone else might not have read that one Guardian article.
Yeah, it's like the, you know, is coffee good for you question or something like that, right? You if you just follow the stuff that pops up in the papers, there's one study after another on coffee's good for you, and then the other one's coffee's bad for you, and you could go on like this forever. It's very hard to get that kind of, well, I mean, you have to look up the meta-analysis, right? And that's why I did recently, but in the end I've decided not to drink coffee or drink less coffee just because it's like clearly a massive like post-colonial kind of extraction exercise, right? It always comes from poor countries, and those people could be doing something better with their time than making coffee for me.
But is it? Well, I guess it goes into, is the trade actually good for them? Is it good for them? I don't know if it is good for them, or, you know, what are their working conditions?
Yeah, and that goes back to,
would they be doing anything else with the coffee?
Would they even be there if it wasn't for colonialists? You know what I mean? Would they even... I mean, it just seems that, well, you know, the sugar and coffee trades, right, were established by slavers. And the people who are still in those countries, still doing that, are still basically in that system.
What, because they don't pay like farmers very much?
And far worse. I mean, even like, man, I don't even want to talk about it, but avocados. Like, apparently, there's criminal cartels run these like avocado rackets.
Really?
And because there's so much money in it. And it's just a kind of like, it's a form of extraction from those countries, right? Where there's money to be made, there's going to be people, and specifically in poor countries. I don't know. It just feels like and I'm not going to stop drinking coffee and buying avocados, but I feel wary of those things because I know where they come from, and I know that there's very little way that I can actually find something that really is fair trade. Like, I have so little insight into that. I think that's mainly the important issue, that standards are improved for these types of countries who we do trade with, right? Because if they were being paid what you might enjoy, like think is reasonable for them, then you wouldn't have a problem. You'd be like, that's okay, because they want to sell that and we're just trading our services, and otherwise, you know, they wouldn't be able to continuously, you know, because trade is not necessarily a bad thing. It's only if people are treated fairly during the process. Notoriously, farmers, even in the UK, I think 1 in 5 are poor, like in poverty. Even though they give like government grants and such, but they have to pay farmers to be farmers now. So I think anything to do with things which are not going to be services and within trade that are high. So it's all about skills and education in general. And until maybe there will always be some levels of inequality unless, you know, people are more radical in the sense of there was
there's a company, it's a financial services company, and the CEO decided to pay everyone $70,000
I remember, yeah.
minimum.
Yeah.
And that distribution, or the understanding of being like, okay, well, I want our company to be like this, it would require just people to say minimum, the lowest of the like people working in any field or sector should be this. And that should be enough for them to be able to thrive, even if it's comparatively not going to be a first world country salary, but not like farmers wouldn't mind if they could, live happily and such. Like, so I think that's mainly the issue rather than trade.
It's a tricky one. I mean, it's probably beyond the scope of this podcast to to figure out. I guess all I'm saying is I feel really cautious about
Going to lie down.
that narrative of capitalism making things better for poor people, because it never really has.
I think it hasn't in the past because it's just been slavery and stuff like that. I think many people do benefit from having a job.
Okay. Let me reframe it. Right, if we go back to, and we're probably getting way off the awakening bylines, but if you trace it back to the invention of capitalism, it also invented poverty at the same time. And I'm not saying we can go back to before that time, because we can't. We're in a different place now. But when rich people figured out that they could get even richer by enclosing land and getting people to work on it for them, if just 400 years ago in Britain, they invented poverty, because before that, people were poor, but they were also self-sufficient. And after that, when they enclosed the land and said, okay, you can't actually use that for your sheep grazing or whatever anymore, now you've got to work for me, then people for the first time became really poor. And so desperately poor that they had to move off the land into cities and work in factories.
Yeah, but I feel like it would have been different. Say everyone was super fair, super amazing.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have necessarily been that way. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I feel like if people were paid properly for their services, it's not that there's an issue of working, because working is not necessarily bad, and being paid for your services isn't necessarily bad. It's just if you're not, then that's when it's terrible.
Okay. I think I forgot to bring it, but I will bring you The Divide to read, because he's very persuasive on this stuff, and I'm not. So it'd be a great conversation to have, perhaps once you've read the first few chapters of that, because it's an interesting one, and like you say, it's probably beyond this podcast to really figure it out. I mean, I'm with you in many aspects, but I'm also really cautious about it because of Jason Hickel, basically. So
I also think of our tax system would have to go like hand in hand with it as well, where then there would be a distribution back.
Yeah.
But that's why I don't think that necessary trade is an issue as of what trade is in itself.
Right.
I think it's only an issue if nothing is distributed back, or people are not fairly taxed. Like if they can evade huge taxes.
There's a thing.
Yeah. So like these are more of the issues than people having jobs.
Yeah. Let's have that chat again. Let's have an episode on Jason Hickel. Let's get Jason Hickel on if we can, and have a chat with him about it. That would be amazing.
Cool.
He's a legend. Cool. I would like to raise the topic, since we're drinking this tea, which has in it, what type of mushroom?
Reishi.
Reishi mushrooms.
The mushroom of immortality.
Complete pivot here, folks, to reishi mushrooms.
Yeah. And by the way, Bill has just said and I've never known this before, that you should brew your green tea without a top on.
Apparently so. You heard it from my wife Momiko, who's Japanese, folks. There you have it. Yeah, I know this is a real key thing for you. You're all on the edge of your seats thinking about green tea just there. But apparently...
I think these tips are very helpful.
Gets more oxygen or something, apparently.
Improves the flavour.
And so, reishi mushrooms... Reishi?
Yes.
Yes, not Reiki, folks. Reishi. Do good things for you.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about some mushrooms is that it can help to support our immune system, and reishi is definitely one of them. So how they actually function, I don't know the science of it interacting with our bodies, but there are so many studies, and the really great documentary, Fantastic Fungi,
which we both recently watched,
is a nice entry point into mushrooms and some of their effects. They actually don't go so much into the health benefits. I think they kind of segue into, what different, like, I think the understanding of what mushrooms are or fungi, and what forms they come in, because it's not only just mushrooms. And then it goes into some history of fungi. Then it goes to a guy who researches it, but not so much is told actually in the documentary about loads of the health benefits. So that's actually a bit of a shame.
And it's really
only because I
interesting
know those things before.
I hope that there's a lot more like decent science done on this, because it's fascinating. And I'm really curious, like one of the questions I didn't hear answered in that documentary is why... So why are like mushrooms, fungi, why are they so active? I mean, I get it about penicillin, right? That this fungi has figured out how to fend off bacteria and viruses as it grows, because it needs to. Or is it just bacteria? Probably. Anyway, why are there so many like psychoactive mushrooms and poisonous mushrooms and stuff like that as well? Didn't really go into that, and that's a good question.
I guess in an hour and a half,
there's a lot to cover.
Yeah, it can only do so much. I think it's just a nice introduction. And I think they kind of wanted to show the researcher his story into it in order to be a compelling narrative, so that people can maybe just start researching for themselves. But it's in the same way that we might see different adaptations of why things might be venomous to why they might glow in the dark, and animals and of all sorts. I'm not an anthropologist, but we'd need an anthropologist on probably.
Fascinating show anyway.
It's really great. And the thing with mushrooms is, I don't know, there's loads of supplements now available. People have it in tea form and continuously brew it. You can also eat it. The interesting thing about, like, sometimes they say that mushrooms are a good source of vitamin D, but actually only some of them are, if they've been grown in certain light conditions. And you'll see in the supermarkets a little sticker which tells you some of them that are high in vitamin D. But otherwise, the majority of them aren't.
There we go. And you also have an interesting story about your mother.
My grandma.
Yeah.
She has like the most expensive mushrooms around the world that she drinks in kind of a strong formulation every day. And she's had stage 4 cancer for the past 5, even 6 years now. But she hasn't died.
I love this story.
Just mushrooms are keeping her alive, as well as the will to... her grandchild, so also my cousin, is quite sick, and he's only a little child. But it's almost as if she feels like she needs to be there for him, so she won't die, like physically. She won't die.
Wow. Where's she based?
She's in Croydon.
Right, okay.
So just down south.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, it's a great story. I mean, I would love to. I'm gonna dig into this more.
She's so inundated with mushrooms. Like, more people will give her other mushrooms.
Yeah.
Of course, it's known for like Asian medicine, but she's just like, I can't take anymore. Like, I have so many mushrooms.
Brilliant.
It's so good. And actually, Phil found some psilocybin in the field.
Oh, there we are. There we are. Yes, it does grow everywhere this time of year. It's remarkable. Yeah, psilocybin. Well, there's a story. Yeah, that's a very interesting one again. Like, why? I mean, I guess maybe it stems back to that thing they mentioned in the documentary of how we basically have a common ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
Like, animals and fungi
Mm-hmm.
were sort of the same genus, like 3 billion years ago or something, and perhaps that's what I mean. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Why is anything psychoactive on one angle, but mushrooms in particular? That's very strange.
Well, it's funny because psychoactive is only then that, for us, it happens to interact with us in that way, but otherwise for them, this is just how they are.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? Maybe it's all just a vast coincidence. But it's odd that, I mean, I've read that, say, the psilocybin, the active ingredient, a bit like LSD, it very closely mimics serotonin. I think that was the one, and so hence its crazy powerful action from small amounts. Yeah, interesting stuff. I mean, I personally, I don't know if I mentioned this on the podcast before, but when I really got deeply into meditation, I lost all interest in drugs because I had equally powerful experiences on retreats. And I was like, well, I got here on my own steam, and why would I want to bother with drugs, especially street drugs, which you're just basically buying random crap. You've got no idea what it might actually be.
I feel like the interesting thing for people would be like, okay, say I don't really care about, I have no idea what it might be. Likely that it's going to have maybe some contaminants, but it's not going to kill me. People might say, okay, well, you had to go on a retreat, which was 10 hours a day for 10 days. And that's a lot of investment.
Oh, it's much harder, yeah. Especially people just do them as party drugs on a night out.
Yeah, so they might just say, well, if I can buy it for a fiver or a tenner, then I can have this spiritual experience.
Yeah, it's a very different context for a lot of people. But it's very interesting to hear about the successes of like psychedelic therapy. It's very interesting. Also, there was one of the things that came out of the film was how after these therapy sessions, they measured, I think, like the interconnectedness of the brain, and they found they'd actually grown more brain matter than a control group, something like that. It was very, very interesting.
Yes, that's really interesting. And I guess more science will be uncovered. I have a friend, actually, who's a researcher at UCL, long-term meditation retreater, and he is going... I think the study he's doing at the moment is on taking psychoactives, microdosing or up to a certain amount, but taking them on long-term retreats.
Okay.
In combination.
Love it.
So maybe we can have him on the show.
I'd love to, yeah. It's so Tim Leary. It's brilliant. Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. Funny one is my neighbour was into microdosing. I don't think she still is, but I was just browsing through these articles after watching that film, and came across a picture of her in The Guardian. I didn't know it was in like a 2019 article on microdosing. Which is fascinating. Though there have been studies done on microdosing, and it's very... there's not much evidence yet that it actually does anything much. because they did one with like a control group, and the placebo group had equally positive effects to the people who taken the real thing. So yeah.
And placebo, I mean, might be good enough.
Placebo is very powerful.
Yeah, placebo's almost better to just put everyone in a pretend study group and just give them a sugar pill.
Well, then perhaps that's why homeopathy is still going so strong. I mean, it's a very strange thing, that one.
Yeah, there was, I think maybe a year and a half ago, homeopathy was struck off as a real science to treat things, and its status, was formally taken off.
Yeah. With good reason, from what I've gathered. I mean, as a child, my parents were into stuff like that, and they tried to treat my whooping cough with it. It didn't really work. Many years later, I came down with a TB-related thing, and when they did the x-rays, they're like, oh, you've got old scarring in your lungs there. So it was so freaking bad that my lungs were scarred 30 years later by this cough that they were trying to treat with sugar pills. I mean, there's a few things like that in my childhood that, I mean, it's just freaking woo. And it winds me up so much, that side of, I don't know, my history, because it's impacted me directly, and just in general, I just get so wound up by that stuff. It's partly why I've enjoyed that Conspirituality podcast so much, because getting back to meditation, like there is so much benefit to be had from it. Like it's this obvious, powerful, natural thing we all have access to. And then people build cults around it and enrich themselves and predate on people. And that's also just, it's pretty amazing, really. I feel very lucky that I haven't been like suckered into one of those things.
Well, I think what's important for those who are listening are kind of the, like, especially with people who are wanting to learn more, open, curious, just about anything, right? And being able to be that's like what allows us to be impressionable, and therefore at risk of people who might not have our kind of interest, our interests at heart. And maybe they think they even might be. So there is a lot of room in the spiritual space of all sorts of topics. And sometimes we can't necessarily discern what is okay or what's not okay. But I think a few principles that do help, and maybe Bill, you'll chime in with a few that you might say, is one might be doing some of the practice and seeing the benefits. The second is, if someone is worried about your health or that you're acting differently, sometimes it might be because they don't understand. But the other thing is to also realize that a change has happened, and then to be discerning yourself of what you have become involved in. Does it hurt you? Does it hurt anyone else? Do you think you should be worried about it? I think these questions are really good to be aware of as we traverse unknown spaces. And sometimes, we do want to traverse these spaces because we might learn something that might change our lives. But I think the other is to have caution and continuous thoughts. Like someone might say, but you have to fully believe in this thing, otherwise it's not going to work for you. And I think we should have caution around people who try to say to us, this is the word. And anything else you might add, Bill? These are the first things that arise for me.
I mean, I think for me, it boils down a lot to who's making the money and
Is there money involved?
Is there money involved? And
if not money, are there resources involved in some way?
Yeah, and who's building power in this situation? And if you're following someone who, whether there's money involved or not, but they're sort of building power and dominance over you or others, then that's a sign of caution. I mean, it's a tricky one, you know. I mean, I was thinking back to the Goenka Vipassana tradition, which I've spent a lot of time in, and I still have a lot of time for. I still think that's one of the best examples. It's one of the only examples I've come across of a major global meditation tradition that isn't out to rip you off or build a cult in the same way. That said, it's not without its dangers, and as a big institution, it's quite protective of itself, often at the expense of psychologically vulnerable people, or in fact anyone, because that category includes everyone to some degree or other, who goes on their courses, and they, as a sort of institution out to protect itself, it will cover up and sort of, it doesn't mention it. In my opinion, they ought to at least have a health warning, just like any pill you buy in a chemist. It has a health warning on it, and contraindications and potential things that might happen. Previously, people have been known to run away in the middle of the night naked and die of hypothermia. People have committed suicide during the course or after. People have, because that's real.
Yeah.
That's the reality of very deep, very hardcore meditation practices, especially going into them sort of cold turkey. It's a dangerous and powerful thing to do, and they don't really say that. They just sort of welcome all, and
they say you should. Well, they do ask questions on what your previous have you ever had, and so they want to be aware, because they do say they do specifically say this is not for people who do have
with mental illness,
with mental illness.
But they
although now 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people do have mental illnesses, but might not have realised that for themselves. So that's just people coming into it also unaware of themselves in what they're getting into, and can't properly discern. So they might not put the health warning, but they do try to avoid having people in.
Well, they make out like it's safe for
everyone,
the average person, right? Which is generally true, but
there are exceptions.
But absolutely not 100% true for everyone. And you know, I feel lucky that I got through my first course intact. Really, it was brutally hard. I was very hard on myself during it. And I came out better in some ways. But like many people don't, including my mother, who went on a course.
I would also say many people who do as well, because let's say 120 people go on a course every time. I would say there might only be very small cases within 120 people.
One or two, but one of them might die. I mean, and that is a very, it's a very hardcore thing. I mean, no doctor would do that. You know, no decent doctor would say, this is 100% safe, just come and enjoy it. If you're in basic good health, just do this thing, you'll be fine. It's not like going for a 20-minute walk, which is something we could pretty much recommend to everyone. It's much more like doing a marathon or something, which might kill you in some very small... You know, there's a very small risk that you might die trying to do a marathon, or something similarly like hardcore. So, I think that's irresponsible, basically. I think that's my biggest beef with the Vipassana Foundation. And another thing that I find a little troubling is that beyond the introductory courses and some like, you know, the Satipatthana, that they also do, listeners who haven't gotten into this stuff, if you've done a introductory course, the sort of basic 10-day thing, then you can go back and do the Satipatthana Sutta course, which is based on one of the old Buddhist texts, and it goes a little bit deeper into why the hell you're doing what you're doing. But there's not an awful lot of guidance in it, I would say, beyond, if you're lucky, getting a decent assistant teacher and your own practice. And that's nice, but I feel like when I came across, say, Daniel Ingram's work a couple of years ago, I learned way more about what had happened to me during courses than I ever did from any assistant teacher. It gave me a model to understand some of those things that just wasn't really there. And I never got that kind of guidance from Vipassana. And I'm not saying Ingram's right on everything, but at least it was something. At least it was some kind of model.
Well, I guess, you know, maybe on the Awaken site, we should say, you know, before you embark on a meditation retreat, not just Goenkas, because the majority of them are not going to be... I think it is because of formalized traditions like this that many people have come out unscathed, the majority of people, and then there might be the percentage, the far smaller percentage who don't. But it would be maybe for people like ourselves who have been on it to give a bit more preparatory recommendations.
Totally, yeah.
For that. And what would be helpful. And maybe resources that could be helpful. And is this the right thing for you? And are you ready for it? That kind of thing. But I don't think a doctor or someone who might be a psychotherapist will be able to tell you necessarily if it's definitely going to be safe. So fundamentally, it will always be at your own, you know, choice.
Yeah, your own judgment, but you should be aware of the risks.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's a good future episode. We could talk through that, because there's a lot in that.
As in, what would make one?
Well, like, you know, kind of, are you thinking of going on a retreat? Well, here's what you should know first.
Yeah.
Because I never really had that.
I don't think... Well, actually, I did some research on some of them.
Yeah.
And I only looked up what the experience of people who had documented theirs were.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think it's also important to say how like on a retreat, even to think about how much you want to be doing, because it is 10 hours a day. But I saw some people who were just in their room for many of the hours too and not doing it. So I think you can also, we'll give guidance on that. I think that might be nice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I first did a retreat, I had really no idea what I was getting myself into. And this was the late 90s. You couldn't look it up. There weren't loads of journalists who'd done courses at that point.
Yeah.
It was just kind of my ex-girlfriend at the time had done a course in California and was convinced it was like the best thing possible anyone could do to get on their spiritual quest. And I was so eager for something like that at the time that I was like booked and on a course within a month of hearing about it happening in the UK, because she thought she didn't even realise that they were here. So yeah, I just dived in head first. But would it be nice to know a bit more what I was getting myself into, really? Yeah. We paused there for a moment and decided that the topic of going on a retreat warranted its own episode, which we promptly recorded and will be releasing real soon. Thanks for listening to the Awaken podcast. We hope you enjoyed. Check out the show notes, listen to more episodes, and find our socials at awake-in.com. We'd love to hear your feedback, so do please get in touch.